Hi folks, in this lesson we're going to take a look at some of Angular Material's basic form features. One of the most fundamental aspects of material forms is the mat form field component, which acts as a container for a number of other material form components like inputs, select elements, and chip lists, and it provides common styling and behavior for these components. We'll be using it with text inputs in this lesson. So first of all, let's get a new component set up to host our form controls. And let's add some routing for this. And let's add a link for it to the nav menu. So we already imported the relevant modules into our app module in the last lesson. So if we hadn't have done that, we would need to import mat form field module and mat input module, but we already have those, so we don't need to do that. So let's go straight into looking at the mat form field and input form components. We'll use the mat card again for layout purposes. So the mat-form-field component is used as a container, and this is probably its most basic usage, just a simple container with no additional directives, and inside it we have an input that has the mat input directive added. So once again, we just need to add a little bit of styling for the mat card, just so that it looks like a card. And we've used this a couple of times, so we'd probably add it to some common styling module if we were building a proper application, but I'm just going to duplicate it here just to save time. So let's take a look in the browser. So we can see our form element here. It has underline by default, and we can click into that, and the underline becomes highlighted, and we can type into it like a regular input. Great. So we can enhance this considerably. So if we want to add a placeholder attribute, this will enable another feature of the inputs. So now we can see our placeholder has been added to the field, and as soon as we click into that, then we see this nice little animation where the placeholder becomes a label, and if we click out of it now, then it goes back to being a placeholder. But if we actually type something into it, then it will stay as a label. So the mat form field also allows us to add a label using the mat label element instead. And the behavior changes slightly now. So now the text that we added to the label becomes the initial placeholder for the input. And as soon as we click into it, the label transitions to a proper label, and we then see the placeholder, which is still the original name placeholder that we added just a moment ago. So if we blur the field again now, then it reverts back to how it was previously. And again, if we type something into it, then the label stays as a label. We can also provide input hints for the input, and these will appear in small text below the input. So there are two different ways to add hints. We can add a single hint using the hint label property of the mat form field. And in the browser, we can see that this appears below the input, and that doesn't change at all. We can also add hints using the mat hint element. And we can see that we now have two hints, and by default they get styled so that they appear directly next to each other. We might want to space that out with some padding, but we're not going to worry too much about that for today. So a hint added with the hint label will always appear at the start of the input, but if we want to change a mat hint element hint so that it appears at the end, then we can use the align property of the mat hint for that. And now we can see that it's moved to the end instead. Multiple additional hints can be added using the mat-hint element, but only a single hint can be added with the hint label property of the mat form field. Another common requirement is to add prefixes or suffixes to form fields to indicate a currency perhaps. The mat form field has the mat prefix and mat suffix directives that can be used for this purpose. And let's see now how these appear in the browser. Okay, so we've added a little envelope icon to the start of the field and some text as the suffix to indicate that this input should take an email address. And Angular Material will take care of things so that these prefixes and suffixes aren't overlapped by any text entered into the field. Although in this example, they could probably do with a bit more padding, but again, we're not going to worry too much about that. There's one more child element that the form field component supports, and that is an error message, which will get shown below the input depending on the state of the form control within the form field. We'll need to import a new Angular class into our app module to showcase error messages. We already have the reactive forms module from earlier in the course, but for this example, we don't need it to be that complex. So let's just bring the regular forms module into the app as well. So now we'll need to wrap our form field in an actual form. And now let's make the input required and link it to the new form. So these are all pretty standard aspects of Angular forms. Again, this course isn't about Angular itself, so I don't want to go into too much detail about these, but basically we're just associating the input with the property of the name form. And Angular kind of takes care of things in the background for us. All we need to do is add this name form template reference variable on the form here, and then use this banana box ng model directive here to specify which property of the form this field should be associated with, and that's a property called name, and the form control has this matching name attribute, and we also specify it as required. So now let's add the error message, and we do that using the mat error component. And let's go back to the browser again. Let's open up the console and see what's up. So even though I added forms module to the imports at the top of the app module, I didn't actually add this to the imports array. So okay, great. So by default, you can see the error message isn't displayed, and it's very common to not want to show error messages until the form has been interacted with in some way. So let's just focus the form. And one thing that's apparent is that this little star icon has been added to the label to show that it's required. And if we just click away from the field, then we get the error styling and the error message appears. So there's one more thing that I want to look at today, and that's the different variants of the form field. So traditionally, there's only been one type of form field in Angular Material, and that's the field that we've been looking at throughout this lesson. It's known as the legacy form field. There's now several other form field variants that we can use. Mostly these just result in different styling for the form field, but there is a very slight behavioral change in all of the newer variants also. So first of all, there is what's known as the standard variant. Let's just add one of these to our form. So we can specify the variant that we want to use using the appearance property. And in this case, we just set it to standard. So let's just add a basic input inside here as well. And let's see how that appears in the browser. So it looks very, very similar, and it mostly behaves in a very similar way. The only difference is we get this black underline now when we hover the form field, and we don't get that with the legacy. Aside from that, it's very similar. The behavioral change that I mentioned earlier is that the placeholder doesn't automatically transition to a label now. So if we don't specify a label, then we will just not have a label. We'll just have a placeholder. So if we do want to have a label, then we must add it using the mat label element. So now it should behave as it did before. So this same behavior is true for all of the new variants. So let's take a look at the other two now. So the other variants that we can use are fill and outline, and these have the same behavior with the labels as the standard one did. So really the only difference between these and the standard form fields are the styling. So let's go back to the browser and see this new styling. So we can see the fill one now has this kind of filled box around it. Other than that, it behaves in the same way, and the outline just has an outline. So we can still use hints and prefixes and suffixes and error messages with these new variants just as we did with the legacy one. So in this lesson we looked at the mat form field, which is a fundamental container for some of the basic material form components. We saw the different child elements that we can add to form fields like mat label, mat prefix and mat suffix, mat hint and mat error elements. And we also saw how to make use of the new form field variants that are brand new at the time of recording to Angular material. Thanks for watching.